In the thin air of a still morning, a rich man walks along the rusted tracks of a dead line. He pulls a young woman with her wrists tied, guiding her to the most isolated stretch. On the sides, tall bushes and the distant sound of barking. Between the leaves, a German shepherd watches without moving. The man adjusts the ropes, looks around, and takes a step back. The dog disappears down a corridor of vegetation, descending into a dark tunnel. A distant whistle cuts through the air. The sound of the train grows louder. And there, with the metal trembling underfoot, everything seems about to break in half. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for joining us. Now we return to our story. The morning mist clung to the rusted rails like a shroud of forgotten memories, weaving through the tall grass that had reclaimed what was once the pride of Millbrook, Ohio. Madison Thompson stood at the edge of the abandoned railway, her breath visible in the crisp October air, confusion etched across her delicate features. The silk ribbons tied around her wrists weren't tight enough to hurt, but they were enough to remind her that this wasn't a casual morning walk through the countryside. "I don't understand why we're here, Mr. Harrison," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper as she turned to face the distinguished man beside her. William Harrison cut an imposing figure, even in his 70s. His silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, his expensive wool coat unmarked by their trek through the overgrown path that led to this desolate place. William's eyes, a piercing blue that seemed to hold decades of secrets, studied the young woman with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. "Sometimes, my dear, we must revisit the past to understand the present," he said, his voice carrying the weight of carefully chosen words. "Tell me, Madison, what do you know about your grandmother's time in Millbrook?" The question caught her off guard. Her grandmother, Eleanor, had rarely spoken about her childhood in Ohio, always deflecting questions with a sad smile and a change of subject. "She never talked much about it," Madison admitted, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "She always said some stories were better left buried." A distant rustling in the underbrush caught their attention, and William's expression shifted to one of recognition. Emerging from behind a cluster of wild elderberry bushes came a magnificent German shepherd, his golden coat gleaming in the filtered sunlight. The dog moved with purpose, not the random wandering of a stray, but with the focused determination of an animal on a mission. "Rex," William called softly, and the dog's ears perked up immediately. Madison watched in amazement as the animal approached them with obvious familiarity, carrying what appeared to be an old envelope in his mouth. The paper was yellowed with age, sealed with red wax that had long since cracked and faded. "How do you know this dog?" Madison asked, her confusion deepening as Rex sat obediently at William's feet, offering up the mysterious envelope. The ribbons around her wrists suddenly felt less like restraints and more like costume pieces in an elaborate play whose script she hadn't been given. William accepted the envelope with reverent hands, his fingers tracing the faded writing on its surface. "Rex belongs to these rails, Madison. He's been the guardian of secrets that your family thought were safely buried." He looked up at her, and for the first time since their strange journey began, she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "I knew your grandmother, child. I knew her very well." The weight of those words settled between them like the morning fog, heavy with implications that Madison couldn't yet grasp. "That's impossible," she said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "Grandmother Eleanor never mentioned anyone named William Harrison. I would have remembered." "She knew me by a different name then," William replied, carefully breaking the brittle wax seal. "Names have a way of changing when circumstances demand it, but the heart remembers what the mind chooses to forget." As he unfolded the delicate paper, Madison noticed Rex watching them both with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The dog's eyes moved between her face and William's, as if he understood the gravity of whatever revelation was about to unfold. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of birds beginning their morning songs, but the melody seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "What does it say?" Madison asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. The morning had started so normally, with William appearing at her apartment door in Cincinnati, explaining that he had urgent news about her grandmother's estate. She'd assumed it was about property or inheritance, not about secrets, hidden in abandoned railways in the middle of nowhere. William's hands trembled slightly as he read the contents of the letter, his composed facade cracking for just a moment. "It's a message from your grandmother," he said quietly. "Written before she passed, instructing me to bring you here on your 25th birthday." He looked up at her with eyes that now held a shimmer of tears. "She wanted you to know the truth about your family, about why she left Millbrook, and about the choice she made that changed everything." Madison felt her knees weaken. Her 25th birthday had been just 3 days ago, a quiet celebration. She'd shared with her roommate and a few close friends from her job at the Cincinnati Public Library. How could her grandmother have known to orchestrate this meeting from beyond? How had William known exactly when to find her? "I don't understand any of this," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Grandmother died 6 months ago. How could she have arranged this? And why are you—" She gestured at the ribbons around her wrists, the strange formality of their morning excursion, the dog who seemed to know both of them. "These ribbons," William said gently, reaching out to touch one of the silk bands. They were Eleanor's idea. "A symbol," she said, "of the ties that bind us to our past, even when we try to break free." She wore identical ones the last time she stood on these very rails, 73 years ago. The sound that reached them then was faint but unmistakable, the distant whistle of a train echoing across the valley. Madison's head snapped up in confusion. Everyone in this part of Ohio knew the railway had been abandoned for decades, the tracks too rusted and overgrown to support any rolling stock. "That's impossible," she breathed. But the sound came again, clearer this time, accompanied by the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails that shouldn't have been able to carry them. William smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all morning. "Your grandmother always did have a flair for the dramatic," he said, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into his coat pocket. "She believed that some truths were too important to be revealed in ordinary ways." Rex stood up suddenly, his ears alert and his body tense with anticipation. The dog looked toward the bend in the tracks, where the forest grew thick and the morning mist still lingered, as if he could see something that human eyes couldn't yet perceive. "Mr. Harrison," Madison said, her voice steady despite the surreal turn the morning had taken, "I need you to tell me exactly who you are and what this is all about, right now." William straightened his shoulders and looked at her with a mixture of pride and sorrow that reminded her, startlingly, of her grandmother's expression in old photographs. "I'm the man who should have been your grandfather," he said simply. "And this, my dear Madison, is the story your grandmother never had the courage to tell you herself." The train whistle sounded again, much closer now, and Madison could feel the vibrations beginning to travel through the soles of her feet and up into her bones. Whatever was coming down those impossible tracks was real, and it was heading straight for them. Madison stared at William as the impossibility of his words sank in. The man who should have been her grandfather stood before her on abandoned railway tracks, with a dog that seemed to understand more than any animal should, while the sound of a train that couldn't exist grew steadily louder in the distance. "That's not possible," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She'd grown up wondering about her grandmother's past, about the gaps in family stories and the old photographs where faces had been carefully cut out. Grandmother was married to Henry Thompson. He died before I was born, but I've seen their wedding pictures. William's expression grew infinitely sad. "Henry was a good man," he said quietly. "Eleanor married him 2 years after she left Millbrook, after she thought she'd lost me forever. But Henry wasn't the man she was supposed to marry, Madison. He wasn't the father of your mother." The words hit her like a physical blow. Madison felt the world tilt slightly, as if the very ground beneath her feet had shifted. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Eleanor and I were engaged to be married in the summer of 1951, William continued, his eyes growing distant with memory. "We were planning a life together, right here in Millbrook. But then my father discovered our relationship, and everything changed." Rex moved closer to Madison, pressing his warm flank against her legs, as if sensing her distress. The dog's presence was oddly comforting, a steady anchor in a conversation that was unraveling everything she thought she knew about her family. "Your father discovered your relationship," Madison repeated, trying to process the timeline. "Why would that matter? You weren't children." William laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I was William Ashford then, heir to the Ashford steel fortune. My father had very specific plans for my future, and they didn't include marrying Eleanor McKinnon, a railway worker's daughter from the wrong side of Millbrook." He gestured toward the rusted tracks beneath their feet. "These rails were built with Ashford steel, Madison. My family owned half this town." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. "So you were forbidden to marry her," Madison said slowly. "More than forbidden," William replied. "My father threatened to destroy her family if I didn't end things immediately. Eleanor's father worked for our company, and her younger brother was attending college on an Ashford scholarship. One word from my father, and their lives would have been ruined." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I was young and foolish enough to believe I could find another way, that I could convince him to change his mind." The train whistle sounded again, and this time Madison could see a faint plume of steam rising above the tree line. The impossibility of it made her head spin, but she found herself caring less about the logic of the situation and more about the story William was telling. "But you didn't find another way," she said, "and it wasn't a question." "No," William admitted. "I delayed too long trying to find the perfect solution, and while I was plotting and planning, my father acted. He arranged for me to be sent to Europe on business, indefinitely. When I tried to refuse, he showed me photographs of Eleanor with another man." Madison's heart clenched. "Henry." "Yes, the photos had been staged, but I didn't know that then. My father told me that Eleanor had already moved on, that she'd only been interested in my money anyway." William's voice grew bitter. "I believed him because it was easier than fighting a battle I wasn't sure I could win." "So you left," Madison said, the tragedy of it settling over her like a cold blanket. "I left," William confirmed. "I spent 3 years in Europe, building a new identity, a new fortune. When I finally returned to America, I was William Harrison, and I discovered that Eleanor had indeed married Henry Thompson and moved to Cincinnati. I thought that was the end of the story." Rex whined softly and nudged William's hand with his nose. The old man looked down at the dog with genuine affection. "But Rex here has been keeping secrets all these years, haven't you, old friend?" "How old is that dog?" Madison asked, because the math wasn't adding up. "A German Shepherd couldn't have been alive in 1951. This Rex is the great-great-grandson of the original Rex," William explained. "Eleanor trained the first Rex to guard something very precious in these woods. The knowledge has been passed down through 5 generations of dogs, each one living here in the wild, each one trained by the previous generation to wait for the right moment. Wait for what moment? William reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver locket that Madison immediately recognized. Her breath caught in her throat. "That's grandmother's locket," she whispered. "She wore it every day of her life. How do you have it?" "She asked Henry to mail it to me after she passed," William said gently, "along with a letter explaining everything. It seems that your grandmother never stopped loving me, Madison, just as I never stopped loving her. And it seems that the child she was carrying when I left Millbrook wasn't Henry's daughter." The world went completely silent around Madison. Even the approaching train seemed to fade into background noise as the full weight of William's revelation hit her. "My mother," she breathed. "Catherine was my daughter," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor never told me, never. Reached out because she thought I had abandoned her willingly. She raised Catherine as Henry's child, and Henry loved her as his own. But 3 months ago, when the doctors told Eleanor she didn't have long to live, she decided it was time for the truth to come out." Madison felt tears streaming down her face without realizing she'd started crying. Everything made sense now. The way her grandmother had always watched her with such intensity, as if searching for something in her features. The way she'd always insisted that Madison had inherited her stubborn determination from someone other than Henry. "That's why you're here," Madison said, understanding flooding through her. "That's why she arranged all this. She wanted you to know your heritage," William confirmed. "She wanted you to understand that you come from a line of strong women who fought for what they believed in, even when the odds were against them. And she wanted you to know that despite everything that went wrong, despite all the missed opportunities and misunderstandings, love doesn't die just because circumstances force it underground." The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate more strongly, and Madison could now see the locomotive emerging from the bend in the tracks. It was an old steam engine, the kind that hadn't run on these rails in decades, painted in deep forest green with gold lettering that was too far away to read clearly. "How is this possible?" Madison asked, gesturing toward the approaching train. William smiled, and for the first time all morning, the expression reached his eyes. "Your grandmother had many friends in Millbrook, Madison. The Railway Preservation Society has been working for months to restore this section of track in her honor. She planned every detail of this day, down to the timing of the train's arrival." Rex barked once, sharp and clear, as if announcing the train's approach. The dog's tail wagged furiously, and Madison realized that this was what he'd been waiting. For all these years, all these generations, this moment when the past would finally catch up with the present. "She knew," Madison said wonderfully. "She knew you'd both be here." "She knew," William agreed. "Eleanor always was the smartest person in any room. She figured that if she couldn't bring us together in life, she'd find a way to do it after she was gone." As the train drew closer, Madison could make out the figure of the engineer in the cab, and something about his posture seemed familiar. The locomotive was slowing now, the screech of brakes cutting through the morning air as it prepared to stop exactly where she and William stood waiting. Madison looked down at the silk ribbons around her wrists and understood them for what they truly were, not restraints, but symbols of connection, threads linking her to a love story that had begun 73 years ago and was only now finding its proper ending. She was the living bridge between her grandmother's past and her own future, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. The locomotive came to a full stop with a final hiss of steam, the massive engine towering over Madison and William like a monument to a bygone era. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the settling sounds of cooling metal and the distant call of a cardinal in the surrounding woods. Madison found herself holding her breath, waiting for whatever revelation would come next. In this carefully orchestrated morning of surprises, the engineer's cab door swung open, and a man in his 60s climbed down with practiced ease. He wore the traditional striped overalls and cap of a railway worker, but there was something unmistakably contemporary about his bearing. When he turned to face them, Madison felt a jolt of recognition that she couldn't quite place. "Frank Rodriguez," William said warmly, extending his hand toward the man. "Right on time, as always." Frank smiled and shook William's hand, then turned his attention to Madison with eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and something deeper. "So this is Eleanor's granddaughter," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent that spoke of generations in Ohio's diverse industrial communities. "She has Eleanor's eyes." "You knew my grandmother too?" Madison asked, though by now she was beginning to suspect that half of Ohio might have been involved in orchestrating this morning's events. "Frank here has a very special connection to your family," William explained, his tone suggesting that another significant revelation was about to unfold. "Why don't you tell her, Frank?" Frank removed his engineer's cap and ran a weathered hand through his graying hair. "I've been waiting 40 years to have this conversation," he said quietly. "Your grandmother saved my life when I was just a boy, Madison, and in doing so, she changed the course of my entire family's future." Rex trotted over to Frank and sat at his feet, clearly as familiar with the engineer as he was with William. The dog's behavior was becoming less mysterious and more like that of a family pet greeting old friends, which Madison found oddly comforting in the midst of all these revelations. "How did she save your life?" Madison asked, settling onto a moss-covered railroad tie. Her legs felt unsteady from the emotional whiplash of the morning, and she needed a moment to process everything she'd learned. Frank sat down across from her, his expression growing distant with memory. "It was 1984. I was 12 years old, and my family had just moved to Millbrook from Texas. My father had gotten a job at the steel mill, and we were living in a company house not far from here." He gestured toward the woods surrounding them. "I was an angry kid, furious about the move, about leaving my friends behind. I used to come out here to these abandoned tracks to throw rocks and feel sorry for myself." "These tracks were already abandoned by then?" Madison interrupted. "Oh yes," Frank nodded. "They'd been shut down since the late 50s when the steel mill modernized and started shipping by truck instead of rail. But the rails were still solid in most places, and kids from town would sometimes dare each other to walk the line from one end to the other." William was listening intently, as if hearing parts of this story for the first time. Madison realized that while her grandmother had apparently orchestrated this entire meeting, she hadn't necessarily shared all the details with everyone involved. "One afternoon in November," Frank continued, "I was out here feeling particularly sorry for myself when I decided to do something really stupid. There was an old trestle bridge about a mile down these tracks, over Miller's Creek. I figured if I could cross it, I'd prove something to the kids at school who'd been giving me a hard time." Madison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning air. "What happened?" "The bridge was rotted through," Frank said simply. "About halfway across, the planks gave way beneath me. I fell 30 feet into the creek, broke my left leg in 2 places, and hit my head hard enough to knock myself unconscious. The water was running high from autumn rains, and I would have drowned if someone hadn't pulled me out." "Grandmother," Madison breathed. "She was out here collecting wildflowers for a church arrangement," Frank nodded. "She heard the splash and came running. Eleanor was 63 years old at the time, but she didn't hesitate to climb down that muddy creek, bank and drag a unconscious kid to safety." Then she hiked back to town to get help, because this was long before cell phones. Madison felt tears welling up again. This was exactly the kind of thing her grandmother would have done, jumping into action without thought for her own safety, when someone needed help. "But that's not the end of the story," Frank said, his voice growing warmer. "While I was recovering in the hospital, Eleanor came to visit me every single day. She brought books, helped me with homework I was missing, and most importantly, she listened when I told her how angry and lost I felt. She was good at that," Madison said softly, remembering her own conversations with her grandmother during difficult times in her life. "She was extraordinary at it," Frank agreed. "When I was finally released from the hospital, she'd arranged for me to start working part-time at the Millbrook Historical Society, helping to catalog old railway artifacts and documents. She said she thought I might find it interesting, given how much time I'd been spending on the tracks." William was smiling now, clearly enjoying this part of the story. "And did you find it interesting?" "It changed my life," Frank said emphatically. "I became fascinated with railroad history, with the engineering and the stories of the people who built these lines. Eleanor encouraged me to study hard, helped me apply for scholarships, even wrote recommendation letters when I applied to engineering school at Ohio State." Madison was beginning to see the full picture. "You became a train engineer because of her." "I became a lot of things because of her," Frank corrected. "I graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering, worked for the Norfolk Southern Railway for 30 years, and eventually started my own company restoring vintage locomotives for museums and historical societies." He gestured toward the magnificent engine behind him. "This beauty is one of mine, a 1952 Baldwin Locomotive Works steamer that I've spent the last 5 years bringing back to life." For this moment, Madison realized, she planned this years ago. "Eleanor contacted me about 3 years ago," Frank confirmed. "She said she had a very special project in mind, something that would require both a restored locomotive and a section of repaired track. She was very mysterious about the details, but she was also very persuasive." William chuckled. "Eleanor could convince anyone to do anything if she set her mind to it. I should know." "She paid for everything," Frank continued. "The locomotive restoration, the track repairs, the permits from the county to run a single special journey on this section of abandoned line. She said it was for a family reunion of sorts, and that it needed to happen exactly 73 years after the last train ran these rails." Madison looked between the two men, amazed at the complexity of her grandmother's plan. "How many people were involved in arranging today?" "More than you might think," William said. "Eleanor spent her final months reaching out to everyone who'd ever mattered to her in Millbrook, calling in favors and sharing just enough of the truth to get them invested in her plan. The mayor, the historical society, the county commissioners, even the local newspaper editor." "The newspaper editor?" Madison asked. Frank grinned. "There's going to be quite a story in next week's Millbrook Gazette about the return of passenger service to the old Thompson-Ashford line, complete with photographs of today's ceremonial run. Eleanor wanted there to be a permanent record of this day." "Thompson-Ashford line?" Madison repeated, catching the significance of the name. "That's what these tracks were called originally," William explained. "Before my father had the name changed to just the Ashford line in the 1950s, Eleanor thought it was time to restore the original designation." Rex suddenly stood up and trotted toward the engine, looking back at them expectantly. Frank laughed and got to his feet. "I think Rex is telling us it's time to move along with the schedule. Eleanor was very specific about the timing of everything today." "What happens next?" Madison asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. "Next," William said, offering her his hand to help her up. we take a journey to the place where this story really began. There's something waiting for you at the other end of this line, Madison. Something Eleanor wanted you to have, but only after you understood where it came from. Madison looked at the restored locomotive, its brass fittings gleaming in the morning sun, and felt a sense of anticipation building in her chest. Whatever her grandmother had planned for the final act of this elaborate reunion, Madison was ready to see it through. She untied the silk ribbons from her wrists and retied them around the handle of the locomotive's boarding step, a gesture that felt symbolic in ways she couldn't fully articulate. "All aboard," Frank called out cheerfully, and Madison realized that the most important part of their journey was just beginning. The passenger car that Frank had coupled to the locomotive was a masterpiece of restoration, its mahogany paneling polished to a warm glow and its brass fixtures gleaming like jewelry. Red velvet seats faced large windows that offered panoramic views of the Ohio countryside, and Madison found herself settling into a seat that felt like stepping back in time. William sat across from her, while Rex made himself comfortable on the floor between them, his intelligent eyes alert and watchful. As the train began to move with a gentle lurch and the rhythmic chuff-chuff of the steam engine, Madison felt a peculiar sense of coming home to a place she'd never been. The sensation was unsettling and comforting at the same time, as if her very DNA recognized this journey, even though her conscious mind had never experienced it. "How long is this trip?" she asked William, watching the familiar forests of southern Ohio roll past the window. "About 45 minutes to our destination," William replied. "The track runs through some of the most beautiful countryside in this part of the state. Eleanor always said this was her favorite train ride in the world." "She rode this line before?" William's expression grew wistful. "Every Sunday for 2 years, when we were courting, I would take the train from the Ashford estate to pick her up at the Millbrook station, and we'd ride together to the end of the line for picnics by Harmony Lake. Those were the happiest days of my life." Madison watched the landscape change as they traveled, the dense woods giving way to rolling farmland dotted with red barns and white farmhouses. It was quintessentially American countryside, the kind of scenery that appeared on postcards and in paintings meant to evoke simpler times. "Tell me about those days," she said. "What was grandmother like when she was young?" William's face lit up with memory. "Eleanor was extraordinary," he said simply. "She was 22 when I first met her, working as a secretary at the railway office in Millbrook. I'd come in to review shipping manifests for my father's steel business, and there she was, efficiently managing 3 different railroad clerks while simultaneously helping an elderly farmer figure out how to ship his prize bull to the state fair." "That sounds like her," Madison smiled. "She was always organizing everyone around her." "She had this way of making everyone feel important," William continued. "It didn't matter if you were the wealthiest man in town or the fellow who swept him. The station platform, Eleanor treated everyone with the same dignity and respect. It's what first attracted me to her, actually. I'd grown up in a world where people's worth was measured by their bank accounts and family names, but Eleanor saw something deeper in everyone she met." Rex lifted his head and looked toward the front of the train, as if sensing something ahead that the humans couldn't yet perceive. Madison had grown increasingly impressed with the dog's apparent understanding of their situation. It was as if he'd been briefed on the entire plan and was serving as a kind of furry coordinator for Eleanor's elaborate final gift. "What happened to change things between you?" Madison asked, though she suspected she already knew the broad outline of the story. William sighed deeply. "Politics, money, and family pride," said bitterly. "In 1951, my father was planning to run for the Ohio State Senate. He had dreams of eventually making it to Washington, and he believed that every aspect of our family's life needed to support that ambition. My engagement to Eleanor didn't fit his vision of the proper political wife. Because she wasn't wealthy? Because she was independent, William corrected. Eleanor had opinions about things like workers' rights and fair wages. She believed that companies had a responsibility to their employees beyond just paying them. Enough to survive. My father saw her influence on me as a threat to everything he'd built. The train began to slow slightly, and Madison could see that they were approaching a small station platform in the distance. The building looked freshly painted in cheerful yellow and white, with flower boxes under the windows and a sign that read Harmony Lake Station in elegant script. "Are we stopping here?" Madison asked. "This is our destination," William confirmed. The end of the line, just as it was 73 years ago. As Frank brought the locomotive to a gentle stop, Madison could see that the platform wasn't empty. A small group of people stood waiting, and even from the train window she could tell that they were dressed in their Sunday best. An elderly woman in a navy blue dress held a bouquet of white roses, while a man in a dark suit carried what appeared to be a leather portfolio. "More surprises?" Madison asked, though by now she was beginning to expect them. "Eleanor's final gifts to you," William said softly. "She wanted to make sure you understood not just where you came from, but what it means for where you're going." Frank appeared in the doorway of their car, his engineer's cap in his hands. "We've arrived at Harmony Lake Station," he announced formally. "All passengers for the Thompson-Ashford Memorial Service, please prepare to disembark." "Memorial service?" Madison repeated, feeling a flutter of anxiety. "Don't worry," William assured her. "It's not what you're thinking. Eleanor wasn't one for traditional memorial services anyway. This is something much more fitting to her personality." They stepped down from the train onto the platform, where the waiting group immediately approached them with warm smiles. The elderly woman with the roses stepped forward first, her eyes bright with emotion. "You must be Madison," she said, in a voice that carried the musical cadence of someone who'd spent a lifetime teaching children. "I'm Margaret Hensley, and I was Eleanor's best friend for 67 years. She told me so much about you." Madison accepted the bouquet of white roses, breathing in their delicate fragrance. "It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Hensley. I wish I'd known that Grandmother had stayed in touch with friends from Millbrook." "Oh, she never lost touch," Margaret laughed. "Eleanor might have moved to Cincinnati, but her heart never left this place. She called me every Sunday for decades, and we exchanged Christmas cards every year with long letters, catching up on everything happening in our families." The man with the portfolio approached next, extending his hand with professional courtesy. "Madison Thompson, I'm Robert Walsh, attorney for the Eleanor McKinnon Thompson Trust. Your grandmother established quite an extensive plan for today's events, and I have several documents that require your attention." Madison looked between the attorney and William, feeling overwhelmed by the continued revelations. "What kind of documents?" "Property deeds, mostly," Robert explained. "Your grandmother has left you ownership of several significant parcels of land in this area, including the restored section of railway track we've just traveled and the original Harmony Lake Station building." "She's left me a railroad?" Madison asked incredulously. "She's left you a legacy," William corrected gently. "Eleanor spent the last years of her life quietly purchasing every piece of property associated with our story. The land where we met this morning, the railway line, this station, and the cottage where we used to have our Sunday picnics. She wanted to make sure that the place where our love story began would be preserved for future generations." Margaret clapped her hands together with delight. "Oh, you must see the cottage, dear. Eleanor had it completely restored, and it's absolutely beautiful. She always said she hoped that someday it would be a place where other young people could fall in love and dream about their futures together. Rex barked once and trotted toward a path that led away from the station platform into a grove of maple trees showing their full autumn colors. The path was marked with a discreet wooden sign that read, Harmony Lake Cottage, Esther 1847. "Shall we?" William asked, offering Madison his arm. As they walked along the well-maintained path, Madison marveled at the thoughtfulness and complexity of her grandmother's plan. Eleanor had apparently spent her final years not just orchestrating this single day of revelations, but creating a lasting tribute to a love story that had been interrupted but never truly ended. "William," Madison said as they walked, "what would have happened if you and grandmother had been able to marry? Do you think you would have been happy?" William was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "I think we would have been extraordinary together," he said finally. "But I also think that the lives we actually lived, the people we became because of the challenges we faced, those experiences shaped us into who we were meant to be. Your grandmother raised your mother to be strong and independent, just as Eleanor herself was. You carry that strength, Madison, and it's a gift that might never have existed if our story had unfolded differently." As they rounded a bend in the path, Madison caught her first glimpse of Harmony Lake Cottage, and she gasped in delight. The small building was a perfect example of 19th century craftsmanship, with white clapboard siding, forest green shutters, and a wraparound porch that offered a stunning view of the lake beyond. The cottage looked like something from a fairy tale, nestled among the golden maples, with smoke curling from its chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. "Welcome home, Madison," William said softly, and for the first time all day, Madison truly understood what he meant. The interior of Harmony Lake Cottage took Madison's breath away. Every detail spoke of careful restoration guided by deep love and intimate memory. The living room featured a stone fireplace where a cheerful fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with built-in bookshelves filled with classic literature. Comfortable furniture in soft blues and creams created an atmosphere of peaceful refuge, while large windows offered stunning views of the lake beyond. "This is exactly how it looked in 1951, William said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor remembered every detail. Margaret bustled around the cottage with obvious familiarity, adjusting cushions and checking that everything was perfect. "She had photographs," Margaret explained to Madison. "Eleanor saved every picture from your courtship days, and she used them to guide the restoration. She wanted everything to be exactly as it was when you two were young." Rex padded through the cottage as if he owned it, finally settling in front of the fireplace with a contented sigh. Madison was beginning to understand that the dog's presence wasn't coincidental at all. He was as much a part of Eleanor's plan as the restored train and the renovated cottage. "Rex lives here, doesn't he?" Madison asked, and William nodded. "Eleanor arranged for a caretaker to live in the cottage and take care of Rex and his descendants. The man who's been watching over everything is actually Margaret's grandson, David. He's been waiting to meet you." As if summoned by his name, a man in his 30s appeared from what Madison assumed was the kitchen, carrying a tea service on an antique silver tray. David Hensley had his grandmother's warm eyes and a gentle smile that immediately put Madison at ease. "Miss Thompson," he said formally, setting the tea service on a low table near the fireplace. "It's an honor to finally meet you. Your grandmother spoke of you often in her letters to my grandmother." "You've been living here?" Madison asked, accepting a delicate china cup filled with perfectly brewed Earl Grey. "For the past 3 years, David confirmed, ever since Mrs. Thompson purchased the property and began the restoration. She was very specific about how she wanted everything maintained, and she visited several times to oversee the work personally. Madison felt a pang of sadness that her grandmother had undertaken such an elaborate project without ever mentioning it to her family. "I wish I had known about this place while she was still alive." "She wanted to tell you," Margaret said gently, settling into a chair near the window. But Eleanor believed that some gifts are only meaningful when they're received at exactly the right moment. She said you needed to understand the whole story before you could appreciate what she was trying to give you. Robert Walsh, the attorney, opened his portfolio and spread several documents on the table. "If I may," he said, "there are a few more details about your inheritance that we should discuss while we're all here together." Madison set down her teacup and leaned forward to examine the papers. The legal documents were extensive, but as Robert explained each one, the scope of Eleanor's planning became even more impressive. "In addition to the railway property and this cottage," Robert began, "your grandmother has established the Thompson Ashford Foundation, with you as the primary beneficiary and board chairwoman. The foundation's purpose is to preserve historical railways throughout Ohio and to provide educational opportunities for young people interested in engineering and transportation history." "She's created a foundation?" Madison asked, looking at William in amazement. "With significant funding," Robert continued, "Mrs. Thompson liquidated most of her investments and retirement accounts to endow the foundation with $2.3 million. The income from that endowment, combined with donations she's already secured from various historical societies, should provide a substantial operating budget for many years." Madison felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of her grandmother's gift. "I don't know anything about running a foundation. That's where I come in," Frank Rodriguez said, appearing in the doorway with a broad smile. "Eleanor asked me to serve as the foundation's technical director. My locomotive restoration business will become part of the foundation's educational programs. And I'll be helping with the administrative side," Margaret added. "Eleanor and I spent many hours planning the foundation's activities. We have ideas for summer camps, school field trips, apprenticeship programs, and even a scholarship fund for students pursuing degrees in engineering." David gestured toward a hallway that led to the back of the cottage. "Would you like to see your grandmother's office? She set up a complete workspace here during the restoration planning." Madison followed him down a short hallway to a sunny room overlooking the lake. The office was a perfect blend of vintage charm and modern functionality, with an antique oak desk positioned to take advantage of the view. The walls were covered with photographs, architectural drawings, and what appeared to be detailed project timelines. "She worked here every day during her visits," David explained. "Sometimes she'd sit at that desk for hours, making lists and checking items off as they were completed. She said planning this day was the most important project of her life." Madison approached the desk and found herself staring at a large frame photograph that dominated the workspace. It showed a young Eleanor and William standing on the very railway platform where they'd boarded the train that morning, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Eleanor was wearing a simple white dress and holding a bouquet of wildflowers, while William looked handsome and carefree in a light summer suit. "That was taken the day I proposed," William said, softly from behind her. "June 15th, 1951. We'd just returned from a picnic by the lake, and I'd finally worked up the courage to ask Eleanor to marry me." "She said yes," Madison observed, though it wasn't really a question. "She said yes," William confirmed. "We were planning a September wedding. Eleanor had already chosen her dress and started making arrangements for the ceremony at the little church in Millbrook." Madison picked up a leather journal that lay open on the desk, recognizing her grandmother's. Neat handwriting on the pages. The journal appeared to be a detailed timeline of the day's events, with notes about train schedules, catering arrangements, and even specific conversation topics that Eleanor hoped would be covered during various parts of the reunion. She planned everything, Madison marveled, flipping through pages of careful preparation, even what we would talk about. Your grandmother always believed that important moments deserved proper planning, Margaret said from the doorway. She used to say that chance was fine for everyday occurrences, but matters of the heart required deliberate attention to detail. Madison found a page in the journal marked for Madison to read alone and looked up at the others questioningly. William nodded toward a comfortable reading chair by the window. "Take your time," he said. "We'll be in the living room when you're ready." Alone with her grandmother's final written words to her, Madison settled into the chair and began to read Eleanor's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Madison, if you are reading this, then my elaborate plan has worked, and you have finally learned the truth about your family's history. I hope you will forgive an old woman's dramatic tendencies, but some stories are too important to be told in ordinary ways. You are the granddaughter of two people who loved each other deeply, but were separated by circumstances beyond their control. You are the daughter of a woman who grew up believing she knew who her father was, when the truth was much more complicated and beautiful. You are the inheritor of a love story that was interrupted but never truly ended. I have given you these properties and this foundation not because I want you to become a railroad preservationist, though you're certainly welcome to pursue that path if it interests you. I have given them to you because I want you to understand that love leaves traces in the world, that the places where we experience joy and heartbreak become sacred in their own way, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is preserve those places for future generations. William is a good man, Madison. He was a good man when I fell in love with him 73 years ago, and he remains a good man today. The years have taught me that there are many different kinds of love, and the love between grandparents and grandchildren is one of the most precious. I hope you will allow him to be the grandfather you never had the chance to know. Live boldly, my dear girl. Love deeply, and remember that every ending is also a beginning. All my love always, Grandmother Eleanor. Madison wiped away tears and looked out at Harmony Lake, where the afternoon sun was casting golden reflections on the calm water. Through the window, she could see William and Margaret walking along the lakeshore with Rex trotting beside them, and she realized that her grandmother had given her something much more valuable than property or money. Eleanor had given her a family, a history, and a purpose that connected her past to her future in ways she was only beginning to understand. Rising from the chair, Madison carefully closed the journal and made her way back to the living room, where the others were waiting with expectant faces and warm smiles. It was time for the final act of Eleanor's carefully orchestrated day, and Madison was ready to embrace whatever came next. The golden hour was approaching as Madison rejoined the group in the cottage living room, and the warm light streaming through the windows seemed to transform everything it touched into something magical. The faces around her, people who had been strangers just hours ago, now felt like family she was meeting for the first time rather than the last. "How are you feeling, dear?" Margaret asked gently, her experienced teacher's intuition reading. The emotions that played across Madison's features overwhelmed, Madison admitted honestly. "Grateful, a little scared, but mostly amazed at how thoroughly my grandmother planned all of this." She looked at William, who was sitting in what had clearly been his favorite chair 73 years ago. "I keep thinking about all the years we could have known each other." William leaned forward, his eyes warm with understanding. "I've been thinking the same thing, Madison. But your grandmother taught me something important in her final letter to me. She wrote that regret over lost time only makes sense if we waste the time we have left. Robert Walsh gathered his documents and prepared to leave them with Madison for her review. "There's one more thing your grandmother wanted me to share with you," he said, pulling a final envelope from his portfolio. "This contains her suggestions for the Foundation's first major project." Madison opened the envelope and found detailed plans for converting the restored railway line into an educational heritage railway, complete with weekend excursions for families, special events for local schools, and partnerships with other historical societies throughout Ohio. The scope was ambitious but thoughtful, designed to honor the past while creating new opportunities for future generations. "She's thought of everything," Madison said wonderingly. "There are even plans for hiring Frank as the primary engineer and establishing apprenticeships for young people interested in learning locomotive operation and maintenance." Frank grinned widely. "Your grandmother and I spent many hours discussing those plans. She had very specific ideas about how to make railroad history come alive for kids. Did you know she was planning to partner with the Ohio Railway Museum to create traveling exhibits that could visit schools throughout the state?" David brought out a leather photo album that had been resting on a side table. "Mrs. Thompson put this together during her last visit," he said, offering it to Madison. "She called it The Full Story and said you should have it as a record of everything that led to today." Madison opened the album to find a comprehensive visual history of her grandmother's life, starting with childhood photographs from Millbrook and continuing through her courtship with William, her marriage to Henry, the birth and raising of Madison's mother Catherine, and dozens of candid family moments from over the decades. But what struck her most were the photographs from Eleanor's final years, showing her grandmother actively involved in planning and overseeing the restoration projects. "She looked so happy in these pictures," Madison observed, studying images of Eleanor, consulting with contractors, reviewing architectural plans, and even helping to paint the cottage's front porch. "She was happier during those final months than I'd seen her in years," Margaret confirmed. "Eleanor said that finally being able to tell the complete truth about her life was the most liberating experience she'd ever had. She felt like she was giving you the gift of knowing exactly where you came from." William stood up and walked to the window overlooking the lake. "Madison, there's something else your grandmother wanted you to know, something I haven't told you yet." Madison felt her heart skip slightly. After all the revelations of the day, she wasn't sure she could handle another surprise. "What is it?" she asked. William turned back to face her, his expression a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "Eleanor arranged for me to receive a complete medical workup 6 months ago, including genetic testing and family medical history. She wanted to make sure that you had access to your complete biological heritage, not just the emotional parts of the story." He handed her a thick folder, marked with the logo of the Cleveland Clinic. "Everything is in there, Madison. Genetic, predispositions, family medical history going back 4 generations on my side, even recommendations for preventive care based on our combined family patterns. Eleanor wanted you to have every possible advantage for living a long and healthy life." Madison accepted the folder with trembling hands. "She thought of medical history too?" "Your grandmother was thorough about everything that mattered to her," Margaret said with a fond smile. "And you mattered to her more than anything else in the world." Rex suddenly stood up and padded to the front door, looking back at them expectantly. Frank checked his pocket watch and nodded. "The return train leaves in 20 minutes, he announced. "But Madison, you're welcome to stay here as long as you'd like. David can drive you back to Cincinnati whenever you're ready." Madison looked around the cottage one more time, trying to memorize every detail. Tomorrow, she would have to return to her regular life, to her job at the library and her small apartment in the city. But she knew that everything had changed irrevocably. She was no longer just Madison Thompson, library assistant and solitary, young woman trying to figure out her place in the world. She was Madison Thompson, granddaughter of a great love story, inheritor of a legacy, and chairwoman of a foundation dedicated to preserving history for future generations. "I'd like to stay a little longer," she said. "There's so much to process, and I think I need some quiet time to really absorb everything that's happened today." William approached her, and for the first time all day, pulled her into a gentle hug. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "But remember that you're not alone anymore. You have a grandfather who would very much like to be part of your life if you'll have me." Madison felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she hugged him back. "I'd like that very much." As the others prepared to board Frank's train for the return journey to Millbrook, Margaret pressed a piece of paper into Madison's hand. "Eleanor's recipes for Sunday dinner," she explained. She always said that the best way to honor family traditions was to keep cooking the food that brought people together. Frank tipped his engineer's cap to Madison. "The train will run every Sunday from now on," he said. "Regular Heritage Railway service, just like your grandmother planned. You'll always have a way to get back here whenever you need to." David remained behind with Madison and Rex, helping her settle in for what she decided would be her first night in the cottage. As evening fell over Harmony Lake, Madison found herself sitting on the front porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars reflect on the calm water and thinking about the extraordinary chain of events that had led her to this moment. "You know," she said to Rex, who had positioned himself as a faithful guardian beside her chair, "Grandmother Eleanor would have loved knowing that her story would inspire other people. She always believed that love stories had the power to change the world, one heart at a time." Rex wagged his tail as if in agreement, and Madison realized that her grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the property or the foundation or even the revelation about William. Eleanor's greatest gift had been showing Madison that love transcends time, that family connections run deeper than conventional relationships, and that it's never too late to embrace the fullness of your own story. As she sat there in the peaceful evening air, Madison began to envision the future of the Thompson-Ashford Foundation, the Heritage Railway that would bring families together for magical journeys through Ohio's beautiful countryside, and the countless young people who would discover their own passions through the educational programs Eleanor had planned. It was a legacy worthy of a love story that had waited 73 years for its proper ending. "Thank you, grandmother," Madison whispered to the stars, "for everything." The next morning, Madison would begin the practical work of implementing Eleanor's vision. But tonight, she simply sat in peaceful gratitude, surrounded by the physical manifestation of a love that had never truly ended, watching over a legacy that would touch countless lives for generations to come. Rex settled his head on her lap with a contented sigh, and Madison knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Dear friends, we hope Madison's incredible journey of discovery has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. This beautiful story of love transcending time, of family connections that run deeper than we ever imagine, and of the power of one woman's determination to unite the past with the future, reminds us all that our own family stories are filled with magic waiting to be discovered. If you've been moved by Eleanor's elaborate plan to bring her granddaughter home to her true heritage, we have curated a special collection of equally captivating stories about love, family secrets, and the extraordinary lengths people go to for those they cherish. You can find our carefully selected playlist by clicking the link to your left. These stories explore the beautiful complexity of human relationships and the surprising ways that love finds a path through even the most challenging circumstances. If Madison and William's reunion has inspired you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love in all its forms. We'd love to hear in the comments below about your own family, discoveries, or the unexpected ways that love has shown up in your life. Have you ever uncovered surprising family connections? Do you have your own Eleanor in your life, someone who went to extraordinary lengths to bring family together? Share your stories with our community of listeners who believe, just as we do, that every family has tales of love and connection waiting to be told. Don't miss our upcoming stories about second chances, hidden legacies, and the beautiful ways that the past reaches forward to embrace the future. We'll be here every day with new tales that remind us all that love truly conquers time.